All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Lunch and Learn on the Atlantic Black Box Project. It's a public history initiative devoted to researching and reckoning with New England's role in the slave trade. Our guest today is Meadow Dibble. Meadow is a visiting scholar at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and she also taught at Colby College from 2005 to 2008. Originally from Cape Cod, Meadow launched the Atlantic Black Box in 2018 after what she calls a brutal awakening to the reality of her hometown's deep investment in the business of slavery. Meadow is currently producing a podcast on this subject with support from the Maine Humanities Council. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations work to protect Maine's environment and our democracy by building diverse coalitions, influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Next slide, and a few technical notes. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. Please send your questions to me through the chat as they occur to you. You can find the chat by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen. And I can keep track of your questions and we'll ask Meadow those during the Q&A session at the end. If you have any technical difficulties during this webinar, please message Will Sedlak, also through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. The event is being recorded and we will send out a follow-up email later this afternoon with the video and a link to our website with recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you all for joining, and Meadow, I will turn it over to you.
Kathleen, Will, thank you so much for the introduction, for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be with all of you today, and I already see some friendly faces whom I recognize. So I'm gonna start sharing my screen here. Just a sec. Oops, do I have the... It looks like somebody else's screen I'm seeing.
It should be.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Yep.
Wonderful. I'm here to present to you Atlantic Black Box, a project that I am spearheading. But if you had told me even 5 years ago that I would today be running a public history project that aims to involve community members throughout New England in the challenging process of recovering our region's historical ties to the slave trade and unearthing evidence of slavery in this region, I would not have believed you. And I would have had really good reason to be skeptical. First of all, New England and the slave trade, my mind was really not configured to compute such a seemingly simple calculus. Being born and raised on Cape Cod, I thought I knew a thing or two about our region's maritime heritage. I certainly knew that there was nothing in our history to be ashamed of. On the contrary, my hometown, Brewster, has always celebrated its seafaring history. Henry David Thoreau, in fact, stated that my town produced more sea captains than any other town in the country. That has always been a major point of pride. And as you can see, we have the gorgeous mansions to prove it. Brewster long ago branded itself the sea captain's town, in fact. That slate bas-relief sign that you see was actually carved by my father and is at the entrance to the Lower Road Cemetery in Brewster. The Sea Captain's Town is a brand we've been selling to tourists, actually, for as long as I can remember. I come from a family that cares as deeply about historical preservation as it does about community. When I was a kid, my father, whom you see there, the tallest man behind the counter next to my uncle, my father was the storekeeper at the Brewster General Store. It's an old-time country store that has been in continuous operation since the end of the Civil War. He was only the fifth man to hold that position over the course of 100 years. Being part of this lineage was always a great source of pride for me, as was being a native Cape Codder, growing up just miles from the site where the Mayflower first landed. In school, like you, perhaps, I learned that during the Civil War, we had been resolutely on the right side of history. Cape Cod belonged to the free North. We who hail from New England were brought up believing that this region was a bastion of democratic ideals, a hotbed of abolitionism. And of course, much of that is true. These are the stories we tell, but they're very selective. My own community's connection to slavery, I believed, was limited to the fact that we had fought to end that heinous institution. During the 6 years I spent living and working in Dakar, Senegal, in my early 20s, right out of college, this notion of my historical innocence, if you will, as a New Englander, was actually thoroughly enforced, not challenged. While I came to understand that my very whiteness was a privilege that made me complicit with centuries of expropriation and exploitation, still, I benefited from my status as an American. The slave trade, after all, had been carried out by Europeans, not Americans, so I thought, because that's what the tour guide had said at Gorée Island's Maison des Esclaves, after all. Who had forced hundreds of thousands of Senegambians through that famous door of no return that our successive presidents have visited? It was the Portuguese, I learned, and the Spanish, and the French, the English, and the Dutch, but not the Americans. All of these experiences, both in school and out in the world, compounded my sense of historical innocence when it came to the greatest crime against humanity of all time, committed over the course of over 400 years, and by seemingly every power in the Atlantic world, every power, of course, except for my own. As a New Englander, I felt very much exempt from carrying the moral burden of the slave trade. I share all of this with you to explain why a chance encounter with a headstone back in 2016 turned my world on its head and left me reeling, suddenly feeling sure that I didn't know the most important thing there was to know about the very place I thought I knew best in the world. And I want to explain to you how that experience led to the creation of Atlantic Black Box. I hadn't set out to dig up dirt on our esteemed forefathers, no more than I'd been in the market for a full-on identity crisis. I was actually just walking with my young daughters through this cemetery near our home in Brewster when I fell into an empty grave. Well, that's what it felt like. My eyes landed on an engraving in the white marble of a moss-covered headstone, one that I had curiously never seen before, although I'd passed this way hundreds of times throughout my childhood. It read, Benjamin Crosby, died in Africa, 1795, at the age of 27. Africa, I thought, surprised to learn that a young Brewster man had sailed to the continent 200 years before I had flown off to make a life there on graduating from college. For a good 3 minutes, I stared at the headstone, trying to make sense of it before feeling the earth drop out from beneath my feet. Abruptly, I found myself in a terrifying shadow world that had apparently been right under my feet all along. It was like the negative version of that highly polished image we present to the world. I'd never suspected that my quaint hometown could be host to a malignant evil. Why had I been so blind? I wondered. How is it exactly that I had walked past this stone so many times without ever noticing the inscription? Had I been willfully ignorant, naive? Why had it never before occurred to me to wonder if our sea captains had been involved in the slave trade? Did I somehow miss that class in school? Where had I gotten the idea that these guys had mostly been whalers and fishermen? And is it possible that I had arrived at adulthood without knowing the single most important thing there is to know about my birthplace, my beloved home, about these intrepid mariners whose daring feats we celebrate? I had to wonder, would my lifelong pride in this place now turn to shame? And is it possible that my beautiful childhood landscape could be nothing more than a sort of Truman Show Hollywood set? Well, some of these questions I actually asked out loud, but no one I spoke with could tell me what Benjamin Crosby was doing in Africa in 1795. I went to the library, as I know to do from my extensive training through graduate school. No books had ever been written on Cape Cod's maritime trade with Africa, or with the West Indies for that matter. So it was unable to find answers in books or by grilling the town historians. I headed back to the cemeteries. And there it was, carved in stone. More evidence of a presence in Africa. And of an extraordinarily heavy traffic to the Caribbean throughout the 19th century. But no smoking guns, just as the skeptics had told me. Of course, if you bother to ask yourself what was in fact happening in the Caribbean over the course of 3 centuries, then if you're a rational individual, whether you have a PhD or a GRE, you can start to put 2 and 2 together. This is a calculus I had never attempted. Again, why? Well, maybe for the same reason that we do not see slavery depicted in any one of the 5 Pirates of the Caribbean movies. It's something we don't talk about. From the time British colonists began to settle in New England, a trade route was quickly established between our northern colonies and the British West Indies. Those Caribbean islands offered the perfect conditions for cultivating sugar, a hot commodity. So hot, so lucrative, in fact, that the islands quickly came to be used exclusively for that purpose, such that all food and supplies had to be imported. That is where New England came in, provisioning the West Indies with the food and tools needed to run their sugar plantations became a full-time occupation for New England colonists. In fact, our region's economic ascent in the 18th and 19th centuries was a direct result of this commerce that made up one leg of the triangle trade. So here's a question. If Cape Codders clearly had no moral qualms about supplying those West Indian plantations with the salt herring that would feed the enslaved African laborers of the Caribbean, or the grains that they would consume, or the hardware that they would use to till the fields, or the livestock that would run the plantations, how likely is it that Cape Codders or New Englanders drew the line at importing slaves? What are the chances that this particular cohort of seafaring men, the Cape Codders, left the insanely, obscenely high profit margin commerce in the hands of their neighbors to the south in Rhode Island, or to the north in Maine on strictly moral grounds? The reality is Boston merchants regularly organized slaving voyages, as did their peers in Brunswick, in Bath, in Portland, in Portsmouth, in Newburyport, and Gloucester. Salem, Bristol, Newport, New Bedford, Mystic, New York. This is a commerce that was embraced by mariners up and down the New England coast. Northerners had essentially cornered the market. And I know this now thanks to an emerging field of scholarship, which I discovered as I began digging into these questions. These are three important works that I highly recommend. Joanne Pope Mellish sort of broke ground in this field in the 90s with her Disowning Slavery. Our own Anne Farrow, so Anne now lives in Maine. She was in Connecticut when she wrote Complicity with her colleagues from the Hartford Courant. Complicity is a wonderful, many of us feel it's again, a must read for anyone in New England, whether you are a resident or an educator. It's absolutely foundational. And the very recent work by Jared Ross Hardesty, A Synthetic History, Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds, A History of Slavery in New England. You can find all of these resources and many more on the Atlantic Black Box website resources page, which I encourage you to visit. So clearly some historians know about this history of New England's complicity with slavery and enslavement. But I promise you that whether we're talking about Joanne Mellish or Anne Farrow or Jared Hardesty, this history came as a revelation to all of them and as a real gut punch. It had been over 80 years since Lorenzo Green had written his tome on slavery in New England. And there hadn't been, aside from an essay written right at the turn of the 20th century by Lillian Brandt, there hadn't been a study on New England's relationship to the slave trade itself. Until over the past 10 years, scholars have made this a particular focus of study. So it was that though I was unable, in my early searchings to find works that were specifically devoted to Cape Cod's relationship to the slave trade or to slavery or to the West Indies trade, I was able to find these works, which, well, actually, Jared's just came out this year, so not that one, but these works helped to orient me in the field. And some will say that the dearth of scholarship on this topic is due to the fact that there simply is no hard evidence of slave trading in this region. Certainly finding smoking guns is not easy. Why? Because as early as 1788, slave trading was banned by Massachusetts, which of course at the time included Maine. So Massachusetts passed a ban on slave trading in 1788, and it wasn't until 3 decades later that the US would pass a federal ban on slave trading in 1808, at which point slave trading became a federal crime. Did that stop New Englanders from pursuing the trade? Sadly, it did not. Slave trading among New Englanders persisted right through the Civil War. As, excuse me, as my colleague Kate McMahon at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture will tell you. Again, if you go to atlanticblackbox.com, right on our homepage, you will find a data sheet compiled by Kate McMahon that presents just some of her initial findings about Maine ships involved in the slave trade. And if you'd like more information on this, and you haven't yet listened to our interview, Kate and I spoke with the folks from Maine Calling back in January, and you can find that episode both on our website and on theirs, devoted to this topic of New England's role in the slave trade. So on the one hand, we have some difficulty because the folks who were pursuing this trade were pursuing an illicit trade. It was illegal, So they were covering their tracks. That is a reality. But we also have the problem of a biased archive. So much of the information about our role in this trade was swept under the rug. If it wasn't thrown overboard by the captains themselves, it was politely swept under the rugs or put on the back shelves of some of our historical societies. And there, when you really look at as I showed you before, the tremendous evidence of our heavy involvement in the West Indies trade, which after all is full complicity with the slave trade, you have to wonder how it is that we haven't, as a community, as a region, until now, really felt this a subject worth digging into and talking about. The fact that whether it's Maine or Massachusetts or Rhode Island or Portsmouth, New Hampshire or Connecticut, that our economies were built off of that trade. This is the commerce to which we owe our economic ascendance. So there really is a towering pile of evidence if we care to look at it. And so it would seem that, you know, one of the challenges that we face today is that we have developed the habit as a society, as a region, of turning away from that evidence. A sort of willful amnesia has set in over the years. I am a convert to history. I am not a historian. I was trained in literature. I studied literature at Colby College, and then I returned to Colby College 10 years later to teach in a literature department. I'm a story person, so I feel very much it's important for me to acknowledge that I come to this field as very much a convert. I did not know I needed to be aware of our history. I thought I knew enough. I trusted that the historians were on it, that the histories that I could find in the library on New England were complete, that the work had been well done, that it was relatively unbiased. It appears that that is not the case. And so really, I am a convert to history, but more than that, I've become a sort of a missionary on a proselytizing mission. I'm trying to convert everyone, individuals throughout New England, to convert to history, to take history personally, to come to this as with a sense of personal responsibility, the responsibility to know. We have these cliches that we repeat, and we know that they're truisms, and so they're a bit abstract in our minds. We say, if you don't know your history, it will repeat itself. We understand this, but really and truly, we are living this at this very moment. And we have this notion, I think, too, that what we don't know doesn't hurt us. But I think one of the objectives of Atlantic Black Box is to demonstrate the ways in which what we don't know about our history hurts others tremendously, and has. And so specifically communities of color whose presence in New England has been effaced down through the decades and centuries. Communities of color absolutely participated in building this place, and those fine buildings that we so appreciate, the wonderful stone walls throughout New England. This is evidence of enslaved labor right here before our eyes, but we just don't know it. I'm gonna look and see how I'm doing on time, and bring you through a couple more slides. Really, the mission of Atlantic Black Box is to invite individuals and institutions throughout this region to join together in a collective project of recovering this history. It's a recovery project. There is something redemptive, I believe, in the act of picking up a metaphorical shovel and beginning to dig right where we are at the micro local level, saying, it is my responsibility to know what happened here, who built this place, what capital from where went into building this environment that I have been benefiting from, appreciating, et cetera, that has been influencing me and my sense of identity through time. So we need to dig, we need to begin asking the right questions, and fundamentally, I believe we need to share our findings. One other element that has been preventing us from really coming into a full knowledge of this history is the divisional, sort of factional nature of both the archive and the divide between academia and the public sphere. Atlantic Black Box exists to help bridge all of those divides. We want to serve as a, to help scholars translate what they know into a language that the general public can understand. But fundamentally, we also know that the scholars cannot do this work on their own. There is far, far too much history to uncover, because it is literally everywhere throughout New England, not just on the coast, but throughout our towns. And that it's going to take a collective effort. It's going to take everybody, because so many hands went into covering this up, burying this history. It's going to take just as many hands to actively join together in unearthing it and sharing our findings. So Atlantic Black Box 2 serves as a gathering place. You may be wondering about the name Atlantic Black Box, where that comes from. It is, we're making reference to the black box on an aircraft, which we look to in the event of a tragic crash, because that is where the flight data has been recorded. It will help us to understand what happened, what caused it, and importantly, to prevent that from happening again. Well, the ships that left here and sailed the Atlantic were not carrying black boxes. And the account books that those captains had on board were, as I said, often tossed overboard as soon as it was possible. Without the data, without this evidence of this trade, how can we begin to understand this place that we love and what built it? Well, we have to retroactively, as a community, reconstitute the black box. We have to feed in the data, and that will allow us to understand what happened here, and most importantly, what we need to do going forward to make this the community, a community that we can be proud of, one that is based on racial equity and justice. I want to play for you just briefly before Q&A an excerpt from it's actually just a little 4-minute sample from the podcast that Atlantic Black Box is in the process of producing with partners from Teaching Hard History. And if you're not aware of the Teaching Hard History podcast, I highly, highly recommend it, especially if you are educators, because what those folks do so brilliantly is they take the work of scholars and translate it into a language and materials that educators can use in K through 12 classrooms. So we're currently producing a pilot episode of the Disease Ship podcast. The Disease Ship, based on my research, a story that I dug up in my own town of Brewster about a voyage that took place 200 years ago, a pair of ships that were built right here in Maine that sailed to West Africa, to the Caribbean, and back to Boston. So I'll just let you listen, and then after that, we can just go straight to questions.
If you'd been standing on Boston's Long Wharf on August 1st, 1819, you would have smelled it long before you saw it. The putrid odor that blew into the harbor that day made the entire city sick to its stomach. Dock workers, well accustomed to unpleasant odors, suddenly found themselves doubled over, wrapped in a sickly embrace so suffocating they'd talk about it for years to come. Even customs agents, sitting in their stately offices, were not spared the revolting stench. Fishermen, laundresses, caulkers, street urchins, if you were human and had a nose, you couldn't help but stop whatever it was you were doing to scan the horizon for the source of the corruption. Then it appeared, the 10 Brothers, the long-awaited tall ship belonging to some of the biggest names in Boston shipping. 11 months earlier, an influential group of merchants had sent her to trade on the west coast of Africa, expecting their joint venture to reap major profits. And now, their ship had finally come in, but it was reeking to high heaven. When the 10 Brothers docked, longshoremen and customs officials climbed down into the ship's hold, but they didn't find the cargo of gold dust and coffee that had been reported in the press. In fact, there wasn't much down there at all, besides the stones that had served as ballast and clouds of mosquitoes, whose pesky ancestors must have stowed away at some African port and multiplied over the return journey across the Atlantic. Within days of the 10 Brothers' arrival, the population's disgust with this foul vessel would turn to terror, as many of those dock workers turned a shocking shade of yellow, started to bleed from every orifice, and finally died in contorted fits of agony. There was never any doubt as to the source of the yellow fever outbreak that ravaged Boston's waterfront that summer. The entire city, it seems, was unanimous in accusing the 10 Brothers of carrying a plague in the place of a cargo, like some malignant Trojan horse. Taking decisive action 11 days after the ship docked at Long Wharf, the Boston Board of Health declared it a diseased vessel and ordered it scuttled and sunk. But this story, full of shocking twists and turns, does not end there. What had begun as a get-rich-quick proposition ultimately led to a public health crisis, followed by a major scandal involving some of New England's most influential figures. The subsequent cover-up and whitewashing campaign was so effective, however, that our collective memory has failed to retain any of this. So, although the captain and crew of the 10 Brothers all hailed from my hometown on Cape Cod, I had to stumble upon the bare bones of this story at the bottom of an empty grave. Somehow, the small town of Brewster has managed to ignore, unknow, or otherwise remain conspicuously blind to the fact that its founding father, Elijah Cobb, whose stately 1799 mansion is now home to the Brewster Historical Society, was publicly accused of illicit slave trading, and that he was responsible for bringing the plague to Boston.
I was just a boy when I first stepped off the land. The vessel shivered loosely when the sailors took my hand. Towards to a cried, my darling, I'll be back again someday. But the restless water stole my words away.
Okay.
If you've been standing on Boston's
No, we
Long
don't want
Wharf
to do that.
on August.
All right, wonderful. That music was a song by the Parkington sisters, who are originally from Cape Cod. So Kathleen, is this, Kathleen and Will, is this a time when you would like to jump in and do the transition?
That would be great. If you could just stop screen sharing and I'll take it back over.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Meadow. That we have a bunch of questions. And before we get to those, I just want to share a little bit of information. Meadow mentioned a number of resources, and want to assure everyone that we will share links to the Atlantic Black Box Project website and Meadow's main calling interview in a follow-up email this afternoon. So you can also sign up when you're there to stay posted on what the project is learning. The idea of recovering our past history to really understand the present moment and to create a community characterized by racial justice and equity really resonated with me. Thank you, Meadow, for being so eloquent in that statement. And it occurs to me and to all of us at MCV that it's necessary to reckon with that, both about New England's role in the slave trade, but also about our difficult history with the tribes in Maine. So I wanted to share for everyone that this week, the tribes in Maine, that's the Aroostook Band of Micmac, the Holton Band of Maliseet, Passamaquoddy tribe, and the Penobscot Nation formed the Wabanaki Alliance to educate the people of Maine about the need for securing sovereignty for the Wabanaki tribes in Maine. And this afternoon's email will include a link to the Wabanaki Alliance this afternoon, and I encourage you all to check it out and perhaps consider donating in support. All right, let's go to some questions. Meadow, what has the project unearthed so far, this sort of collaborative history project?
Sure. So at this moment, we are in the process of doing outreach because this is, we've felt around a little bit, trying to determine what type of organization we would like to be. Will it be a 501c3 nonprofit, et cetera? And really, I think, we've come to think of this really as a coalition of individuals and institutions throughout New England. And to build a coalition, it's really about relationships. It's about getting buy-in. I think that one of the important things to underscore here, and I want to echo your request that folks donate to the Wabanaki Alliance. Atlantic Black Box has been operating for the past 3 years with 0 operating funds, aside from a very generous small grant from the Maine Humanities Council. All of us involved have been doing this as volunteers. And essentially that's part of the proposition. I want to underscore this notion that investing is investigating in sort of the kind of capital that we're talking about here with Atlantic Black Box. So at this moment, we're not looking for donations of money, but we are looking for people to donate an even more important resource, their time. And folks are doing that. So as an organization, as a coalition, Atlantic Black Box is not looking to do all of this research in all of these various communities throughout New England. We want to help facilitate your work in unearthing this history. So we want to give you support, feedback, provide you with a methodology, an easy sort of way in, resources, finding aids, and as I said, doing that outreach among historical societies, libraries, private collections, what have you, so that so that individuals, these people who are willing to donate their most precious resource of time, are able to, like, we empower you, right, to do the work itself. And so specifically, though, I mean, you know, in terms of what we're turning up, so Kate McMahon, I keep pointing to her, but she's doing really, really fabulous research specifically related to Maine. And she's got a forthcoming book devoted to the illicit slave trade by Northerners. But in terms of community work, I mean, we've just been contacted by so many people throughout New England sharing what they're finding in their corners. For example, somebody wrote not too long ago saying that she had found people who were categorized as enslaved, as slaves, in a small Maine town in 1820. So we have this notion that slavery ended in New England in the late 18th century with this progressive, gradual emancipation. However, we are coming across more and more indications that people were still even being noted as enslaved on official records in some of these small communities. So that's mind-blowing, right? And I will just note that with us today are a couple folks in Connecticut, Dennis Culleton, Ronan, who are doing great work with students down in those parts. So Dennis has a project that I encourage you all to check out called the Witness Stones Project, where he and his team are activating students to do the research to identify the enslaved people in the communities at the local level there in Connecticut. And after writing up testimonials, they create these witness stones to commemorate those lives. It's a beautiful project that I encourage you to check out.
Thank you. You know, there are so many places we could go from here. We've got a bunch of questions, but let's stick with language for a second. We have a question about the role of the language of indentured servitude and how folks are defined. And then a follow-up to that of how do we tell the story of the disease ship without associating Black bodies with pestilence and pollution and having sort of a negative cast there? How do you reckon with that?
Yeah, great. And those are two, I think, important and separate questions. But as you were speaking, I was remembering also the connection to the Wabanaki community here. I don't want to pass over this without mentioning the very important fact that the indigenous communities of New England were enslaved also. That in fact, American slavery began with indigenous slavery, and that often, and in the earliest times, it was a question of removing the Indian population to the West Indies, because that removed what was considered a problematic population from lands that the white colonists wanted to seize. And on the return voyage, Africans who had been, again, quote, seasoned in the West Indies were brought up to New England. So enslavement, our nation's history of enslavement is complex and intertwined, and we have a tremendous amount of work to do to understand all of those imbrications. Indentured servitude is not a part of the story that we're researching through Atlantic Black Box. Jared Hardesty, whose work I underscored there, he has a book called Unfreedom, and it centers on Boston's enslaved population, but his point is that there are degrees of unfreedom. So this is a continuum rather than an absolute binary, free versus enslaved, where indentured wouldn't have a place in there. But indenture is a very important topic, but it is not within the scope of Atlantic Black Box. And then to the question about the diseased ship, it's a really important point, because there, in the past, and even to the present, as we have seen, even today, the association between disease and spreading disease and people of color. There is a sort of this correlate is made. There is a slippage. There is a semantic sort of, so the diseased ship metaphor that we're working with is really about America. Some refer to slavery as our original sin, but there are increasingly people talking about slavery and racism as a disease, right? As an illness that we suffer from and that we need to heal from. Shea Stewart Boulay of Black Girl in Maine frequently uses the language of disease in speaking about racism, and it is in that vein that we invoke it in this metaphor of the diseased ship. It was literally this ship, the 10 Brothers, built in Maine, in Sullivan, Maine, was determined by the Boston Board of Health to be a diseased vessel. That is the language that they used. And so I appreciate, though, that, that awareness that, we do not want to perpetuate that sort of semantic slippage where disease would be associated with the bodies of people of color.
Right, it's really about being intentional with our language, and I appreciate that clarification. You mentioned the Teaching Hard History podcast and some other resources for educators. Could you talk a little bit about the process of getting this history into school curriculums, not as an add-on, but as the core way that we understand our history?
Yeah. Atlantic Black Box has 5 main areas of activity. The public research aspect, where we all we crowdsource this history. Public programming, so we plan to do many events, a series of talks, but also exhibits, and advocacy, so supporting, for example, the Wabanaki Alliance or the recent commission on racism, that has just been created. Bills in the legislature, helping to support bills that work towards creating greater racial equity, and again, Black Box, the metaphor is also drawing on that of Black Box theater. So how do we bring people into history through story, through telling compelling stories? And I think what I'm building up to is that perhaps the most important aspect of our work is education. I mean, ultimately, all of this is about supporting educators and supporting students to pursue this investigation themselves, and to give them the help, help provide the tools for processing this very difficult history. So currently, Atlantic Black Box is, we have been in discussions with Portland Public Schools, and I'm happy to say that we will be offering a what they call a parent university, so available to parents throughout the district. This will be in the fall. We will do a 2-session unit devoted to New England's role in the slave trade and the business of slavery. And that, because parents are a key stakeholder. Teachers' professional development is extremely important, and we hope to reach teachers through the podcast, for one, and the materials that we will be building alongside the podcast. Teachers should be able to use that in their curriculum as well. But I will just say that over the spring semester, we worked with a couple of students at Chevris High School here in Portland. They were doing a service learning project, and they reached out to us and said, hey, is there some way in which we could contribute to your project? And, in pandemic conditions, I'm kind of scratching my head, but I said, hey, what if you repeated the experiment, the experience that I just told all of you about, of going into the cemeteries and looking for this evidence inscribed on headstones. So after giving the students the historical sort of context, they went out, one to Brunswick, one here in Portland, and they came back with these incredible findings. So they had this, carved in stone history that we took that and we showed them how to, from there, find more information that would help contextualize their findings. These are the sorts of project-based learning units that we want to offer through Atlantic Black Box. We do not want to tell educators what to do or how to do it. We just want to complement what they're doing. Ultimately, of course, this material needs to eventually make its way through the curriculum so that it is completely integrated. But that is a very long process. So we're just doing what we can now to sort of lay some groundwork for that.
That's fascinating and makes me want to go out and do some walking around cemeteries in my town. And I wonder, is that what you would recommend that those of us participating today, if we want to get digging, is that the first step? Yeah,
so I have a whole list of things you can do even today, but yes, why not? That very thing. So it's, I don't have a better name for it. I just refer to it as the Died In Project. So go to your local cemetery. If you're in a coastal town, so in the town of Brewster, there are 7 different cemeteries. So find your oldest cemeteries. And I think that you will find that you're not going to find it universally on all of the oldest stones, but during certain periods like late 1800s, late 1700s into until about the mid 19th century, you will often find these inscriptions: died in Havana, Cuba, died in Bermuda, Barbados, what have you. And yes, lift that information, write it down, send it in. So the first thing I would love to urge all of you to do is go to atlanticblackbox.com, and where it says join us, just click that and be in touch. That's key, because this is a work in progress. We are fully just in the building process right now. And so we don't want to make any claims that we've got it all figured out or we've got the tech all, one of these days, someone's going to come along with a whole lot of money and tech support and help us figure out how to do things with bells and whistles. For the time being, we can be low tech. It's the information, it's the data that matters. So yes, do that. If you're connected with historical societies, or if you're not, I mean, likelihood is your town has one. Go and ask, what does our town have to do with the West Indies, with Africa? What do you know? What can you show me? And, you know, if you're really interested in shipping in the maritime industries, as I know many people are here in Maine, you know, find, you know, search that track, like whatever it is that is most compelling to you, right? Grab onto that and pursue it. So what were these ships used for? Where were they sailing? What were they transporting? You know, so going to Maine Maritime Museum, to Bath, etc. Who was on the crew? Like if you can search out, you know, manifests, crew lists, etc. So, and then, yeah, and stay in touch, because we will have support for all of those things online soon.
This is absolutely fascinating. The last question I think we have time for today may be a little bit premature, and that's what have you learned about Maine in this process?
Hmm.
And it sounds like that's emergent, so it's not something that you could check off a box, but curious if you have a big takeaway so far.
Yeah. You know, I've learned a lot about myself in relationship to Maine. This is the third time that I've lived in Maine. So as I told you, I'm originally from Massachusetts, but I went to Colby as a student, went back as a professor, and now here I am living in Portland. And what I realize is how little I actually noticed about my surroundings when I was here those other times. And one thing that I really want to stress is I believe in circling back to where we come from. We have this idea here in sort of Western society in general, in the US maybe in particular, of the linear route to progress, onward, upward, that it's a teleological sort of march forward. I really think we need to operate on a different kind of model. And maybe as environmentalists, you can all appreciate, you know, that the circular reuse, right, recycle, return to where you're from, and ask the questions anew. Ask them again, and just really dig in. I love Maine, like I love Massachusetts, and it's my very sense of devotion to these places that I love, not wanting to tear anything down, but wanting to understand, because I believe that that is true stewardship. We need to be stewards of history in the way that we are stewards of the environment. And the way that we do that is primarily through, you know, sharing our number one resource, again, which is time and interest.
Meadow, I can't thank you enough for a fascinating and really inspiring presentation today. Thank you. And thank you to all of you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. As I mentioned, we will email out a brief survey this afternoon with some links to the resources that Meadow mentioned. I know I can't wait to get more involved in the Atlantic Black Box Project, and have a feeling I'll have some really good company with participants from this webinar. If you enjoyed today's event, I encourage you to join our future Lunch and Learns every Friday from 12 to 1. Our topic next week is reducing the carbon impact of our built environment, another form of stewardship. We'll be joined by two members of the Maine Climate Council's Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group, Ellen Belknap and Jesse Thompson, to explore low carbon building projects that make use of really innovative materials and techniques. Thank you again, Meadow, and thank you to everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kathleen and Will.
Thank you so much, Meadow.
Appreciate it.